took the life of his girlfriend because he was convinced that she wanted to eat him. On January 3rd of this year, 46-year-old Jared Wolf and his girlfriend Jane White were going to a friend's house in Sunbury, Pennsylvania to all get high together. They were all smoking together, having a great time, until suddenly Jared felt like his life was in danger. Jared pulled out a paranormal meter and wanted to check for energy. The meter received a high reading of paranormal activity, which scared Jared. At that moment, Jared thought his friends were out to get him, and mistakenly he thought that one of his friends got a white rag, put something on it, and was trying to put it over his mouth. Somehow Jared came up with the conclusion that his friends and his girlfriend were trying to eat him. To get out of this situation, Jared ran to his car, he got his gun, and loaded a round into the chamber. His girlfriend Jane followed him to his car to see what was going on, but when she opened the passenger door, he fired right into her direction. Unfortunately, by the time paramedics arrived, she had already passed away from the gunshot wound to her chest. Once Jared had fired that shot, he got in his car and drove to his brother's house. Jared told his brother what had just happened while he still had the gun in his hand, so his brother called the cops and he was arrested. When Jared was being questioned, he told police he had did this due to self-defense. He also admitted that he was too messed up to help his girlfriend, so he just left the scene and left her there. Jared is currently in custody at the Northumberland County Jail and is being held without bail.
He unalived a 23-month-old baby and then posted memes about it on his Instagram. This case was sent to me via email with insider evidence and information, but the messenger would like to remain anonymous. 23-month-old Ezekiel wet the bed, so this is when his mother's boyfriend, 20-year-old Bobby Curry Jr., went to give Ezekiel a bath. Bobby claimed that during the bath, their puppy jumped up, causing Ezekiel to fall, hit his head on the edge of the bathtub, and then land on the floor. Bobby DM'd his girlfriend, who is also Ezekiel's mother, about the incident on Instagram. Then he waited 2.5 hours to call the police. Police did not believe Bobby's story, but instead believed that Bobby abused Ezekiel after seeing that he had wet the bed. Ezekiel had suffered from brain bleeding, 45 minutes without oxygen, and he also had additional bruising on the back of his head, all causing Ezekiel to pass away. After spending 2 months in jail, Bobby is out on bond at home, claiming that he did nothing wrong, showing no remorse. The person who sent me this case stated that Bobby had demonstrated aggressive behavior in the past. When Bobby was angry, he would pretend to be a bull. He would start huffing and ramming his head into his stepfather repeatedly. I also been sent screenshots from Bobby's Instagram stories where he posts things like, "If you don't know the whole story, shut up," or "Why every time one dude F up, we all ain't." The lack of accountability honestly just scares me so much, but what do you guys think about this case?
He took pictures of her lifeless body before stuffing her in a suitcase. That sentence alone captures the sheer cruelty of what happened to Grace Mullane, a 21-year-old traveling the world, documenting her journey and celebrating what should have been the happiest chapter of her life. In December of 2018, Grace was in Auckland, just 1 day away from her 22nd birthday. Like many travelers, she used Tinder to meet people. That's how she met Jesse Kimpson. Their night started normally. Drinks, laughter, bar hopping, the usual. CCTV footage showed them entering the City Life Hotel together at 9:41 p.m. This would be the last time she was ever seen alive. Inside that hotel room, everything changed. Jesse would later claim Grace died during consensual rough sex, but the evidence told a much darker story. Forensic experts testify that she was strangled for 5 to 10 minutes. A slow, sustained act requiring continuous pressure. So no, this wasn't an accident. It was prolonged, deliberate violence. Bruising on her arms and shoulders suggested that she'd been restrained, that likely she fought back, that she knew deep down that something was very wrong. What he did next is what makes this case especially sickening. After killing her, Jesse didn't call for help. He didn't panic either. Instead, he searched the internet for things like rigor mortis and flesh-eating birds. He watched violent. He took photos of her, reducing her to an object, like she was something to document rather than a human being who had just lost her life. Then, while her body was still in that hotel room, he went on another Tinder date. It's that level of detachment that's hard to process. It wasn't just the murder, it was the complete disregard for her humanity. He treated her like she was disposable, like she didn't matter. Days later, when Grace stopped responding to messages, her family grew worried, so they reported her missing and a search began. On December 9th, her body was discovered stuffed in a suitcase, buried in a shallow grave in the Waitakere Ranges. During the trial, Jesse stuck to his story. He said it was an accident, but the jury didn't believe him. They saw the evidence for what it was, an intentional murder. He was convicted of murder in 2019 and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 17 years before parole. And even after everything, the evidence, the trial, the conviction, Jesse never gave a real explanation for why he did it. No motive, no moment of truth, just nothing. What do you guys think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.
There's a reason people are outraged by this documentary. It's one thing coming to terms with a horrific double murder, but what the police did in this case is absolutely sickening. If you've watched Murder in the Park on Sky, you will know exactly what I mean. This is not a sponsored video. I just need to get it off my chest. And if you don't know this case, prepare for your blood to boil. It was the 5th of June 2020 on a warm, sunny evening in Wembley in London. And the world had been locked down for a while, so many people were kind of only really able to socialise outdoors in sort of big open spaces, public parks, that kind of thing. Bieber Henry, aged 46, and Nicole Smallman, aged 27, were sisters. Bieber was a social worker and loved helping people, and Nicole was super creative. She worked as a freelance photographer. It was actually Bieber's birthday, so the pair of them headed to Friant Country Park with a bunch of friends. As I said, this was lockdown time, so they kind of had no choice really but to just hang out in a park, but they were really enjoying themselves. As the evening progressed, gradually the group dispersed and the friends started to make their way home. But like I said, Bieber and Nicole were really enjoying themselves, so they stayed much later. Nicole sent her boyfriend a text at 1:05 a.m, just reassuring him that the pair of them were dancing in a field and having a good time. And like I said, Nicole was actually very creative and she'd been taking photos of them dancing with these like fairy lights in the dark. It was really wholesome, cute and innocent. The following day, though, it was really concerning to their friends when they were just not answering texts or phone calls. And this was very out of character of them to both be unreachable, especially at the same time. And when their friends and family checked their home, they weren't home either. Something had clearly gone very wrong, so they were reported missing that evening after failed attempts to find them. But the family really felt that the police weren't really taking this very seriously. The police just didn't really seem to be 100% invested. They didn't really seem to be putting in too much effort to find these girls. So the family plus Adam, the boyfriend, started hunting themselves. And it wouldn't be long before a heart-wrenching discovery. Terrifyingly, on the 7th of June, they found a pair of sunglasses and a bloodied knife in that same park. Now, they immediately called 999, and before police even arrived to collect evidence, another horrifying discovery was made. It was the bodies of the two women. They'd been stabbed to death. Bieber had 8 stab wounds, Nicole had 28. Now, in the midst of this absolute devastation of finding 2 loved ones brutally murdered, police were about to show up and do something so disgusting I have no words for it. Denise Jaffa and Jamie Lewis, 2 Metropolitan Police officers, were supposed to be guarding the crime scene and essentially guarding the dignity of these victims. Instead, what they did was disgusting. They posed for selfies with the bodies of the girls in the background, and they posted it to a WhatsApp group chat stating that they were with 2 dead birds. Now, thankfully, a couple of the contacts in that WhatsApp group chat did report this, which as they should, and the officers were suspended and charged with misconduct. While they waited to discover their fate, obviously a murder investigation was underway. Now, the girls' belongings were found discarded in a body of water nearby, and their phones were recovered as well, along with a blood-stained pillow, which interestingly included 3 different sets of DNA. The killer had obviously cut themselves and left their blood at the crime scene. An 18-year-old man called Daniel Hussein from southeast London had interestingly been to seek medical help for a cut that he sustained on his hand. Now, he explained this away as a injury from a mugging. He said he got mugged. This was not the case at all. Police took the mystery blood that they found from the crime scene to compare against the police database, and it was actually a similar DNA, not identical, to one that they had on file. This was Daniel Hussein's dad. He'd had a past caution, so his DNA was on the database, and this was exactly the proof that they needed to raid Daniel's home. Now, Daniel had been found to have been accessing satanic material online, and CCTV also captured him running home that night without any trousers on. So they were wondering, could he have discarded his blood-soaked clothing, hence why he was running home with no trousers? One of the most damning forms of evidence they found in the property was actually in the form of a contract that Daniel had drawn up with a demon. He agreed to perform 6 sacrifices per month, only females, in exchange for winning the lottery, and he'd signed it in blood. Although he decided to plead not guilty, he was found guilty of the murders in 2021 and given 35 years behind bars. As for the police officers, thankfully they were both sentenced to 2 years and 9 months in jail, and they are no longer officers.
She got so upset with her husband that she started picking his brains out. Satyapal and Gayatri Devi were almost married for 20 years and lived in India with their 2 children. Their children lived with their grandmother in a different household because of the constant fights that the couple would have. Satyapal had a drinking problem, and whatever money he would make would go towards buying more alcohol for himself, and he would leave nothing for his wife. Satyapal loved eating non-vegetarian food and insisted on them eating it at their home, but Gayatri was a vegetarian. This was one of the many reasons they would always argue, and even their neighbors were familiar with how often they would argue. Even though everyone knew how often they would fight, they never thought it would end deadly. On August 8th of 2024, Satyapal had requested Gayatri to buy some chicken, but she was unable to, so he started to beat her. This triggered aggression in Gayatri, and she started chasing her husband with a brick. At this point, Satyapal was terrified, and he tried to escape, but he got hit and fell. When she hit him, he was knocked unconscious, and this was outside, so there was a group of people just witnessing all of this. Gayatri got on her husband's chest and started to hit his head repeatedly. This cracked open his skull, and she started to take out pieces of his brain. Policemen just happened to be passing by when they saw a group of people gathered and was met with a gruesome scene. Gayatri was taken into custody and the investigation has started. Her in-laws stated that she had been treated for her mental illness in the past, and her own brother stated that she dealt with violent episodes.
She let her daughter rot in a closet and then told the police she'd been kidnapped. On November 6, 2019, a mother named Brianna Williams called 911 from her Jacksonville apartment, saying her 5-year-old daughter, Taylor, had disappeared while she slept. She claimed she woke up to an unlocked back door, and her child was just gone. At first, it sounded like a sudden, terrifying situation. The police responded quickly, and the search started almost immediately. Flyers went out, people shared her picture, and the community began trying to help find Taylor. But pretty early on, things didn't feel right. Neighbors started coming forward with details that changed the tone of the case. They said they hadn't seen Taylor in months. And on top of that, several mentioned a strong, unpleasant odor coming from the apartment. It wasn't something that came and went. No, it lingered. At the same time, there had been no missing persons report filed during that entire period. That gap immediately stood out to investigators. As they dug deeper, they began reviewing phone records, GPS data, and timelines connected to Brianna Williams. The more they pieced together, the more the inconsistencies appeared. The story of a sudden overnight disappearance started to feel less and less believable. Instead, evidence suggested that something had been going on for a much longer period of time. Information gathered during the investigation indicated that Taylor hadn't been seen alive since May of 2019. That meant months passed between her last confirmed sighting and the 911 call, months where no one outside the home could verify her safety. As investigators followed digital clues, the trail eventually led them out of Florida and into Alabama near Brianna's hometown. In a wooded area there, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Taylor's remains were found buried in a shallow grave. At that point, the case shifted completely from a missing child investigation to a homicide. Evidence presented later in court described prolonged neglect, including confinement and starvation. Reports suggested that Taylor had been kept isolated and had limited access to food and care over time, and the living conditions pointed to sustained mistreatment. After the remains were discovered, Brianna Williams attempted suicide by overdose. She was later charged and ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2022, receiving a life sentence. What did you guys think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.
The terrifying serial killer that inspired the horror movie Scream. In the late summer of 1990, Gainesville, Florida was being absolutely terrorized by a string of brutal murders of college-aged girls. It all started when the bodies of 17-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell were found in their apartment, brutally stabbed to death. Christina had been SA'd and mutilated, and both girls' bodies were posed in a suggestive position. Both girls were supposed to start their first year of college the following Monday. The very next day, the body of 18-year-old Krista Hoyt was found inside of her apartment. Life had been taken the exact same way. SA'd, stabbed, mutilated, and then posed. College students in and around Gainesville, Florida were terrified. Classes were meant to start that week. Thousands of students had just left their parents to come to college, and now 3 girls were brutally stabbed to death within 24 hours, and they lived like 2 miles away from each other. It was chaos in Gainesville, Florida. Students were withdrawing their enrollment into college or transferring schools within hours. Stores were sold out of padlocks, pepper sprays, tasers, baseball bats, you name it. And what was happening to the young girls in Gainesville, Florida started to make news around the country. Family and friends of college students were calling their loved ones to make sure they were okay. And that's exactly what happened to 23-year-old Tracy Pauls. Tracy was in her apartment when she got a call from a concerned friend. She told her friend, "Hey, I'm safe and I feel safe," because Tracy had a 23-year-old male roommate named Manny Thibodeau. Manny was like 6 foot tall, super strong, really big. He was like a former football player. Tracy felt absolutely safe living with this ginormous man. Tragically, within minutes of getting off the phone call with her friend, the killer broke into their apartment as well, unaliving Manny and then SAing, stabbing, mutilating, and posing Tracy the same way he did the other girls. Absolutely no one felt safe, and the police were feeling pressure to make an arrest, and they actually did make an arrest the following day. After receiving dozens of tips for the police to look into one particular creepy college freshman at the University of Florida, the police brought in 19-year-old Ed Humphreys into custody. Ed was kind of odd and distant. He had this really bad scarring around his mouth that he actually got in a really bad car accident the year before, but that didn't matter to anyone. Ed looked scary, and people were scared. And despite not even having the same blood type as the killer, Ed was kept in police custody for 10 months. And even after they found the real killer and Ed's name was cleared, Ed Humphreys said that his reputation and his life were permanently altered after being accused of these heinous killings. It was around this time that the investigators actually got a tip that there was a similar unsolved crime to their slayings in Gainesville. A year prior to the slayings in Gainesville, the bodies of 56-year-old Tom Grissom, 8-year-old Sean Grissom, and 24-year-old Julie Grissom were found stabbed to death inside the Grissom home. Julie had been essayed, stabbed, and posed just like the college girls that were murdered in Gainesville. And the connection between the victims in Gainesville and now the Grissom family murder was actually leaked to the public, which led to a tip from a Louisiana local woman who said that she might know who's responsible for all of these deaths. That lady, Cindy, called the investigators and told them that she knew of a 37-year-old man named Danny Rowling. He had a history of being creepy towards women, a large rap sheet of armed robberies, and recently was let out of prison and living a half-mile away from the Grissoms at the time the Grissoms were killed. Cindy also told the investigators that after the Grissom family was stabbed to death, Danny told her husband that he had a problem and he liked stabbing people. Cindy girl, I appreciate you coming forward when you did, but how did you not connect the dots earlier? Cindy also told the investigators that 3 months before the killings in Gainesville, Florida started, Danny left Louisiana and no one knew where he was. So Danny is definitely looking like a really good suspect, but the police had to prove that he was in Gainesville, Florida at the time that these students were being killed. Danny had this history of armed robberies, and a week before the killings started in Gainesville, there was actually an unsolved armed robbery of a bank. The robber got away with a duffel bag full of money, but the bank teller actually booby-trapped the money, so when the robber tried to mess with it, that red dye would explode all over the money and make it worthless. Police actually found that duffel bag full of red stained money discarded in the woods, and with the duffel bag was a tape recorder, and what's recorded on that tape recorder you will never believe. On the tape was a man singing a little song that he had written about being a mystery killer. It was literally a confession right there for the police.
We push play and we hear this guy singing on there.
As soon as the tape starts playing, I hear Danny playing the guitar.
And even more unbelievable, at the end of the recording, the man said his full name, Danny Rowling. When Danny was arrested, at first he claimed that he was innocent, but he eventually did confess to the killings of all 8 victims. He never expressed remorse or gave a motive for why he did this, but it is said that all of the female victims look strikingly similar to his mother. Danny was sentenced to the death penalty, but first he was able to given a chance to speak, speak to the victims, maybe apologize. That's what a lot of people do. Whether or not they accept apologies, that's on the family. But instead of doing any of that, Danny actually stood up and sang a song to his girlfriend.
The rules say I have to give Mr. Rowling an opportunity to have a say. You have anything you want to say, Mr. Rowling?
Well, sir, if it please the court, could I address the court?
Sure, say whatever you want to say.
Thank you. Give me time. I recall the day I first saw you. I reached out to say I love you, but it was hard to say. I couldn't touch you. So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together.
Excuse me, Mr. Rowling.
Down the path you choose to follow.
Mr. Rowling.
So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together.
What a creep. Danny Rowling was executed in 2006. This was definitely something straight out of my nightmare for sure. Let me know if you guys ever heard this case before. If you watched the end, thank you so much. Let me know what case you will want to see next. And I love you guys. I'll see you tomorrow.
The body of a 38-year-old woman originally from Scotland has been found inside a suitcase in Athens in Greece. It's currently being reported that her remains were found by a homeless man who was walking through a derelict building in the Kipsely, I'll put that on screen, neighbourhood, and that is where he made the discovery. She has been named as Elizabeth Jane Ross, aged 38 years old, originally from Scotland. It's been reported that Elizabeth had allegedly arrived in Greece at the end of June. She'd flown there from the United States and stopped in Cyprus before making her way to Athens. She was allegedly staying with a Greek friend in the capital, and her friends and family knew she was there and she was in contact with them. She was last seen around the middle of July, still in contact, and then seems to have vanished. From current reports, her body was found on the 18th of July, and it seems as though there was no obvious wounds or no obvious sign of death. However, they have confirmed that she had been dead for 5 to 8 days before the time that she was discovered. A hugely unsettling detail in this case, though, that has recently came out is that after she had died, so after the time of death, someone still had her phone, and after she died, messages were still being sent from it. It seems as though these messages were sent and designed to throw people off the scent of looking for her. One of the articles that I found this morning stated that on the 15th of July, texts were sent to family members claiming that she needed some time to herself, and then went on to say that she wanted to be alone for a while. She also sent a message to the Greek friend that she was staying with saying she needs some time and that she's going to a Greek island. I don't know if this has been 100% confirmed yet, however it is shown in news articles, so I do believe this to be true as of now. There's obviously a lot of authorities involved in this case, with the Greek police and the police from Scotland being involved too, and also Interpol. It is said that she was identified through fingerprints from Interpol. That is how they confirmed her identity. So far in this case, nobody has been charged and we don't really know what happened. The toxicology results are still currently pending, and the question as to how she ended up there is still unanswered. As this is an ongoing case, I don't have any further information, but if there is anything else, I will be sure to do an updated video. I just want to take this time as well to send my condolences to the victim and also the family and friends, because this is just an absolutely horrendous case, and I really hope that they can get the answers that they deserve.
Did you guys know that the Exorcism of Emily Rose movie is based off of a true story? Because I didn't, and then I found out, and now I'm scared. Let's start here. Google defines possession of a person as completely controlled by an evil spirit, and it defines an exorcism as the expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposed evil spirit from a person or a place. This is the story of Annalise Michel. Annalise Michel. I think that's how you say it, Annalise, and we're not going to call her Michelle because Michelle is my name and that freaks me out. Annalise was born in Bavaria, West Germany, to her parents Joseph and Anna, and she had 3 siblings, all girls. The girls were raised Catholic. The family was pretty religious. They would go to church twice a week. Annalise has been described as a kind person with great manners, always willing to help anyone with anything, kind, funny, caring, and outgoing. In 1968, Annalise was 16 years old. She was in high school. While at school, she experienced what people now refer to as a blackout. She kind of started just walking around, staring straight ahead in a daze. Annalise herself obviously does not remember what happened at all, but people who saw her described her to be walking around in a trance-like state. Annalise and her family were all thinking, well, that was weird, super weird, but it was the first time that it happened, so they didn't worry about it too much. A year later, however, a very similar blackout happened to her. She was in bed this time. While she was sleeping, she woke up in a trance after wetting the bed. Her body was shaking and she was having convulsions and she could not control it. Following that incident, her parents took her to a hospital where she would meet a neurologist who diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy. That is defined as a disorder that causes seizures, loss of memory, and experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations. That made sense. The symptoms that she was experiencing matched up with that. So Annalise began taking medicine for it. The medicine, though, was not helping. Her symptoms were getting worse at a rapid pace, and she experienced her 3rd seizure. It was around that time when it occurred to her and her parents that maybe this wasn't a medical issue. Maybe this was something that went way beyond that. But in the 1960s, 1970s, exorcisms were not a common thing, really, especially in the Catholic religion. Because of that, it wouldn't be the route that her parents chose to go down until they felt as if they had no other options. When Annalise would pray, she would hear what she said were demons in her head telling her that she was damned and that she would rot in hell. She began to see the face of the devil everywhere. It was following her around, and she would hear voices in her head that sounded like someone whispering in her ear. In 1972, Annalise saw another neurologist how did I just say that word? Neurologist, whatever. Neurologist who prescribed her a new anticonvulsant medication to stop the seizures. They thought they were seizures. But even then, the doctor admitted to not being able to find absolutely anything wrong with her medically on paper. Annalise went on to enroll in university in 1973. It was there where she fell into a very deep depression because she was trying so hard to live a normal life, but it was literally impossible for her. She would pray, but then she would hallucinate. She would take medication, but the voices in her head and her seizures wouldn't stop. She would go to psychiatric hospitals, but they would say that nothing was medically wrong. Annalise felt like she was going crazy, and she was convinced that she was possessed. But how do you beg for help for that? How do you make people believe you if they just don't? Soon, Annalise would not have to beg for help because the things that she was experiencing got so bad, it would become obvious to everyone around her that something extreme needed to be done. She started running around screaming. She would crawl and hide underneath beds at home and underneath tables in Publix. Once her mom caught her peeing on the floor and licking it up. She stayed underneath the table, hiding, barking like a dog for 2 days straight. She would rip off all of her clothing off her body, and her behavior would become uncontrollable. She would become violent, growling and mumbling underneath her breath. She began to eat coal and spiders, and she once bit off the head of a dead bird. But her behavior with anything that had to do with religion or a church was what made people around her also believe that she was possessed by an evil spirit. Annalise said that she could not enter the shrine, referring to a church, I think, because the soil burnt her feet like fire and she could not stand it. She was unable to walk past any crucifix or be near any holy water. When she was taken to a priest, the priest denied an exorcism and told the family that they needed to get the bishop's permission. They were able to find a different priest who believed them. And in a letter to him, Annalise wrote, quote, "I am nothing. Everything about me is vanity. What should I do? I have to improve. You pray for me." In September of 1975, the bishop eventually approved a priest to perform an exorcism, but ordered that it had to be done in total secret. Over the next 10 months, Annalise Michel would go through 67 exorcisms that would sometimes last over 4 hours. Through each exorcism, Annalise began to believe that she was possessed by 6 different demons. I'm going to put the names on the screen because I just can't pronounce them, but she would say that they were all arguing in her head, and she would begin convulsing and communicating through loud growls and fluently in different languages. I listened to the audio tapes once. I'm literally not going to put them in the video for the sole reason that I do not want to hear them again, but you can find them online. They are so scary. During those 10 months, Annalise stopped eating because she believed that she could starve the demons out of her. On July 1st of 1976, at 23 years old, only weighing 66 pounds, Annalise Michel passed away in her own home. The cause of death was ruled as malnutrition and dehydration. After her death, the authorities actually came after Annalise's parents and the 2 priests who had performed the exorcisms because they argued that Annalise could have medically been saved. All 4 of them were charged with negligent homicide. They were all found guilty. The 2 priests were sentenced to 6 months in jail and 3 years of probation. However, the 6 months in jail did end up being suspended, and although her parents were found guilty, they were exempted from any punishment as they had suffered enough. Absolutely bizarre. I get so scared when it comes to paranormal things. Exorcisms are so scary to me. I believe in ghosts fully, and I have many stories to prove why I do, which maybe I will share with my mom sometime later because my mom has actually terrifying stories that have to do with Ouija boards and all this stuff. Anyway, let me know what you guys think about this case. Let me know if you've heard of it before. I hope you guys are all having the best day. If not, go do something to make it the best day. I will say this again, we don't know what's gonna happen with TikTok, but if it does get banned, I will start posting these videos on my Instagram, so go make sure that you're following me on Instagram. Love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video. Massive kiss on the forehead to every single one of you.
She disobeyed her father, so he taped her up and drowned her in a swamp. 18-year-old Ryan Al-Najjar had come to the Netherlands with her family after leaving Syria. Ryan was having a really hard time fitting in at school because her classmates were making fun of her hijab and the way she dressed. Ryan slowly started changing herself. She downloaded social media, she took off her hijab, she started wearing makeup, and she even got a boyfriend. Ryan's father, Khalid Al-Najjar, was outraged at his daughter. He claimed that she was an embarrassment for embracing this new lifestyle. Khalid started threatening Ryan with violence and using duct tape to restrain her so she wouldn't go anywhere, but thankfully, Ryan still managed to escape. Ryan was found and picked up in the car by her brothers. Ryan felt safe with her brothers, and she thought that she was finally out of danger, but her brothers had other plans. Ryan's brothers took her to a nature reserve where they handed her over to her father. Khalid bound his daughter up with duct tape and dumped her in a swamp where she drowned alive. Khalid immediately fled to Syria after unaliving his daughter and is currently a fugitive. Both of Ryan's brothers each got 20 years in prison for helping plan Ryan's unaliving. By the way, before I receive any comments that I have received in the past, this case has nothing to do with race or religion. This case is about an evil man who is still out there somewhere hiding, not paying for what he did to his daughter. What do you guys think of this case?
The horrible parents that allowed their pet snake to eat their toddler. Jaren and her boyfriend Charles lived in Florida with Jaren's 2-year-old daughter Cheyenne. Living in the home was also an 8.5-foot Burmese python that lived in an aquarium in the living room, secured only by a safety pinned quilt that worked as a lid. This particular breed of snakes is known in the wild to be so strong they can kill alligators. But yeah, just put a blanket on top of its cage, that'll be fine. Obviously, no. This python would escape from its cage constantly. Reportedly, it escaped over 10 times in the span of like 1 month. This ginormous 8.5-foot super aggressive python escaping all the time. A concerned family member even offered to buy a proper cage for their pet snake, but Jaren and Charles refused the offer. The Department of Children and Families, DCF, received reports that this was not a household safe for children, that Jaren and Charles were using multiple illegal substances in the same home as 2-year-old Cheyenne. They even admitted to using these substances and said they had no intention of stopping. So the child welfare agent that went to their home saw that there were parents using illegal substances, and a lot of illegal substances, and had no intention of stopping, that there was a ginormous snake that was constantly escaping, and a little 2-year-old toddler in the home on top of that, and still thought it was a safe space for 2-year-old Cheyenne, and closed the investigation. And within 2 weeks of them closing the investigation, 2-year-old Cheyenne would be dead. On June 31st, 2009, after Jaren and Charles were passed out after taking substances, the python escaped its enclosure once again and made its way into Cheyenne's nursery and into her crib. The snake wrapped itself around the baby's body and slowly squeezed the life out of her. I can't even imagine the pain and the terror that this little girl was enduring. I'm sure that she was screaming out for her mommy to come out and save her, but her mother was too high to know. Cheyenne's dead body was discovered by Charles late the next morning after 10 a.m. The python was still wrapped around her body. There were bite marks covering her body, and the snake was trying to eat her. Charles says that he slammed the snake's body on the floor, repeatedly stabbed it before calling 911.
Okay, and what's the problem? Tell me exactly what happened.
Our snake, we have a Burmese python, and she's about 12 foot long. She got out of the cage last night and got into the baby's crib and strangled her to death.
Okay, stay on the line, please.
The snake did survive the stabbing and was relocated. The snake was severely malnourished. She was only 13 pounds when she should have been 150 pounds. Just let that sink in for a second. This was a wild, strong animal, aggressive animal that was being starved to death. That was also not being secured properly, and they were surprised that this was the outcome. It is a tragedy that because of so many people's stupidity, a 2-year-old had to pay for it with her life. Jaren and Charles were both convicted of aggravated manslaughter, sentenced to 12 years in prison, and both released in 2021. And as for the child welfare agency that said that this was a safe household for children, they went on record saying they acknowledge flaws in how the case was handled, but have concluded Cheyenne's death could not be prevented. That is such a cop-out, and honestly so disgusting and disrespectful to say, but sadly it's not surprising. Systems like CPS and DCF are so insanely flawed, and sadly, it's the children that have to pay for it and suffer for it. But that's a whole other video on its own. Sadly, we could talk about that for hours. Recently, we've been doing a lot of videos on the dangers of people having wild animals as pets, and I'll be the first one to admit that there's a lot of people that have snakes and other reptiles and do it in a safe way for humans and for the animals itself. But this is such a clear example of people that didn't do it in the right way, and an innocent child had to pay for it with her life. That should not have to happen. There needs to be more systems in place to prevent this from happening, and I know I'm not asking for too much. If you're still liking the videos we've been doing on when keeping wild animals as pets have gone terribly, terribly wrong, let me know in the comments, and let me know what other case suggestions you'd want to see next. Until then, I love you guys so much, and I'll see you tomorrow. This man has been labeled the worst serial killer of all time. Despite confessing to having over 300 victims, this case has the most appalling ending of any true crime case I've ever heard. If this case doesn't truly terrify you, I don't know what will. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in Colombia to his mother, Belinda. Pedro said that life with his mother was like a living nightmare. Not only was she abusive, but she was also an S worker who would often be with her clients in front of him most nights while he was growing up. Pedro said due to his mother's job and witnessing it so often, as a child he became curious and attempted to essay his own sister. He was caught by his mother, who kicked him out onto the streets to live alone, be homeless, when he was only 8 years old. Pedro grew up on the streets, and he says that before he was 13 years old, he was essayed by 3 men. Having grown up on the streets, Pedro turned to a life of crime in adulthood. At the age of 21 years old, Pedro was arrested for stealing a car, and after being in prison for only 2 days, Pedro was essayed by a group of 4 other inmates. Pedro says that that was his final straw. He was sick of being victimized his entire life, so he actually the very next day slaughtered all of the inmates that attacked him with a makeshift shiv. These are Pedro's first known killings, and they were deemed as self-defense. After Pedro was released from prison, he says that due to the hatred for his mother and the resentment that he felt towards other children that got to live happy, normal lives, he wanted to seek vengeance for his suffering as a child. And since his innocence was stolen from him when he was 8 years old, he targeted little girls aged 8 to 12 years old. In his mind, he says it was an eye for an eye. Pedro began to attack little girls in Peru whose families were poor and usually from an indigenous background. Pedro would stalk a child for a few days, wait until she was alone, and then lure her away, where he would essay and unalive her. Pedro said that afterwards he would have tea parties with their bodies and referred to them as his dolls before concealing their remains. Local people were noticing that dozens of little girls were disappearing without a trace, and after Pedro was caught trying to lure a 9-year-old girl away, he was turned in to the Peruvian police. Sadly, and this is going to be a common occurrence throughout this entire case, those police officers sucked. They said they did not want to investigate Pedro and that there was no evidence that he was behind all of the little missing girls. So instead of trying to find evidence, which is their job, they deported him back to Colombia, where Pedro continued killing little girls in Colombia and Ecuador. Little girls were continuing to go missing by the dozens, about 3 a week at one point, and police continued to not investigate. It's actually been said that the police's mindset were, since these little girls were poor and from poor families, that they weren't worth the money trying to find. It actually wasn't until flash flooding in this area unearthed multiple bodies of little girls that were reported missing that the police in the area were finally like, oh, maybe there is a serial killer. And it actually took the local men to arrest Pedro finally after he got caught trying to kidnap a little girl from a busy market. He was actually mobbed down by a group of locals who turned him over to the police. In custody, Pedro Lopez confessed to killing over 300 little girls in Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. And although in Ecuador at this time, there was a lot of flash flooding, unfortunately, a lot of the little girls' bodies in Ecuador were never found, but they did find 57 bodies in Ecuador. So coupled with Pedro's confession and the fact that there were all these little girls that still were not found, Pedro was charged with 110 murders in Ecuador alone. But sadly, due to the laws in Ecuador at the time, Pedro Lopez could only be sentenced to 16 years in prison after confessing to 110 murders in Ecuador and about 350 total. Which, if you do the math, is about 2 weeks in prison for every child's life that Pedro stole. It's absolutely disgusting and appalling, but somehow it only gets worse. Despite promising to continue killing if he was ever released, Pedro Lopez was actually released 2 years early on good behavior. And after being released from prison, Pedro vanished. To this day, no one knows his whereabouts, where he went, or if he's even still alive. Some people believe that Pedro is living in a Spanish-speaking part of the United States, while others theorize that he was probably taken out in a vigilante killing. This entire case makes me feel super uneasy and sick and absolutely terrified. At one point, Pedro Lopez was actually in the Guinness World Record book for most prolific serial killer. They did remove that because there were a lot of backlash saying that's really insensitive and disgusting, and I completely agree. I can't believe they actually put that in a Guinness World Record like it's something that you want to break the world record for. I don't know, that's just so gross. Have you ever heard of this case before, and what do you think happened to Pedro Lopez after he was released from prison? I don't know, guys. Keep discussing with me in the comments. I just feel really, really gross. To any of the loved ones of the victims, I am so incredibly sorry that your child, your sister, didn't get justice. I actually heard that this was said to be like the biggest mistake in judicial system ever. So I am deeply, deeply, deeply sorry. If you guys are still watching, I don't know how you are, but thank you so much. I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
With the new Netflix series on the Idaho 4 coming out, with Brian Koberger wanting to change his plea to not guilty, and with all the controversy I'm seeing with people debating whether he done it, whether he acted alone, or whether it was a completely different person, I thought now would be the perfect time to cover this case on my page. This has been such a highly requested case, but the main reason I actually want to cover it is because I think we need to remember what these people actually went through, what the victims actually had to endure that night at the hands of an absolute monster. I honestly, watching this documentary, I felt physically sick. I genuinely felt scared in my own home watching this because it just made me feel like these people were innocent. This could literally happen to any of us. A psychopath can just turn like that. So let's talk about it. What actually happened and what is going on now? So, as you will all probably know by now, 4 university students came home from a normal Saturday night out in town in November in 2022, and by the Sunday morning, all 4 of them were dead. They were all stabbed to death in their off-campus house, and 2 of the roommates that lived in this house are still to this day left trying to process that nightmare that still fully isn't over. It's the same for their parents too. They are just left in limbo without their child, with the most horrifying thing ever that could possibly happen. So, who were the victims in this case? Because that should be at the forefront of everyone's conversation, not the perpetrator. First up, we have Madison, who was known as Maddie Mogan. She was 21 years old and she was majoring in marketing at the University of Idaho. She was a member of the Pi Beta Pi sorority house, and she worked part-time at Mad Greek restaurant in Moscow. Everybody who knew her described described her as bright, kind, and full of life. Then we have Kelly Gonzalez. She was also 21 years old. She was a senior studying general studies at the University of Idaho, and she was also a member of Alpha Pi, which was a separate, different sorority group. Her and Maddie were literally inseparable. They were the best of friends and had been since 6th grade in school. They done literally everything together. The same high school, the same college, the same friend group, and then sadly they had the exact same death. Kaylee was actually going to be graduating a semester early, and she had already got a job lined up in Austin in Texas, and she was planning the next chapter of her life. She had her full life ahead of her and so many plans for the near future. Then we have Xana Kernodle. She was only 20 years old, and she was also majoring in marketing and also a member of Pi Beta Pi, the same sorority as Maddie was in. She apparently also worked at the same Mad Greek restaurant as Maddie. She was originally from Avondale, Arizona, and later lived in Post Falls, Idaho. She grew up with her dad and her sister, and the relationship between her dad that you can see in the documentary is heartbreaking. She was also so close and so head over heels in love with her boyfriend Ethan. The third victim in this case is Ethan Chapin. He was only 20 years old, and he was Xana's boyfriend. He was a sophomore majoring in recreation, sport and tourism management and a member of Sigma Chi. Ethan was actually one of 3 triplets from Washington, and he was so close with his siblings and his family. He was just described as being a big teddy bear. He was big, friendly, and he had an amazing, just electric personality. He was absolutely obsessed with country music too, and you can really see that in the documentary. Maddie and Xana actually lived with 2 other roommates, Dylan and Bethany, in a 3-story rental house at 1122 King Road in Moscow in Idaho. Ethan was staying over that night, and Kaylee actually previously lived in that house too. They hadn't actually filled her bedroom, so that was still empty. She wasn't sleeping in there that night though. She was sleeping in with her best friend. On the night of Saturday, November 12, 2022, Kaylee and Maddie went out to the Corner Club in downtown. Later on, they would stop at the Grub Truck, which was just like a food van that was described in the documentary as being one of those food vans that would be disgusting when you're sober, but absolutely amazing when you're drunk. They got food around 1:56 a.m. Xana and Ethan had also been on separate nights out, but everybody seemed to have been back in the house by around 1:45. By 2 a.m, it looks like everybody was back home where they were supposed to be staying that night. Between roughly 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m, somebody entered the house through a sliding glass door on the kitchen floor level of the house. According to the evidence later presented in court, they went up to the 3rd floor first and fatally stabbed Maddie and Kaylee inside Maddie's bedroom. They were found in the same bed. A leather Ka-Bar style knife sheath was found left on the bed near Maddie. That knife sheath would become one of the most important pieces of evidence that police required to get a conviction in this case. Xana, who had just received a DoorDash order of food around 4 a.m, was still active on her phone. Her phone showed activity that she was on TikTok around 4:12 a.m. She actually would have encountered the killer. He went to her room next. She was stabbed more than 50 times, with many of them being defensive wounds, and she was found on the floor of her bedroom, and Ethan was killed in the same room while he was in the bed. I think it is pretty much believed by this point that Xana had actually came out of the room and seen the killer face to face. He then killed her at the door, then went over and killed Ethan. I'm assuming after he had seen this or after he had woken up. I'm not 100% sure if he was awake or asleep at the time. One of the most controversial and talked about things in this case is the surviving roommates and what they saw. One of the surviving roommates, Dylan, was woken up or heard the noises. At first, she thought it was Kaylee and her dog. She heard what she thought sounded like crying coming from upstairs or nearby. She then claims that she heard a male voice saying something along the lines of, quote, "It's okay, I'm coming to help you," end quote. It is said that Dylan opened her bedroom door more than once, and on one of those occasions, she saw a figure dressed in black clothing and a black ski mask covering the lower part of his face, walking past her room and heading back towards that glass sliding door. He walked right by her and he never touched her, he never attacked her, he just left her. This is something that people constantly like to bring up. It is something that I honestly don't know what my opinion is on this. Was he just tired from what he had just carried out? Was there a reason that she didn't get touched? It's something I don't want to speculate on it, because obviously she will find this extremely upsetting, and obviously it's something that she's having to deal with, and she must live with a lot of survivor's guilt. But I have so many questions on this case that I do still feel the documentary didn't answer as well done as it was. Dylan would later tell the investigators that she went into a trauma, what experts call a frozen shock phase. She locked herself in her room and eventually went downstairs to Bethany's room. The two of them had spent hours calling and texting their other roommates and also communicating between each other, saying that they had heard the strange noises from the night before. They were getting more and more worried when nobody was answering them. Around noon the next day, Dylan or Bethany decided to call some of their friends and their friend's boyfriend to come over to the house. Now, this had actually happened on occasions before when the girls were scared. It wasn't completely out of the realm of possibility for this to be happening. This was a pretty normal thing for the girls that were scared by themselves. When the roommates' friends finally came over at around noon the next day, they discovered the bodies. The boyfriend of their friend had discovered the bodies. He was honestly so brave as well. He basically just told them that somebody had passed out. The boyfriend who went in there and found the bodies honestly is an absolute hero. He saved those girls from so much trauma. He never told them what he saw. He only told dispatchers on the 911 call that he found people passed out, and honestly, what he done, you have got to give him the praise for it. 911 was called roughly at 11:55, reporting the unconscious person, and all 4 victims, when emergency services arrived, were pronounced dead at the scene. It was apparent to authorities that none of them had been sexually assaulted or restrained, and Kaylee's dog was found unharmed upstairs. One thing I want to point out, and what I'm not really too sure on what had happened, I know that we hear some dog barking on, I think it's a Ring doorbell footage nearby, or it was the girls' one. Anyone confirm to me why Kaylee's dog never made more of a scene? I don't know if the dog was in the same room. I'm going to assume that it was. It just seems like something that a dog would cause a huge scene over. Another thing I'm confused by. Now, as we know and we have discussed, Dylan was the only person who actually saw the killer that night, and instead of simply being treated as a traumatised survivor and a key witness in this case, her and Bethany became huge targets online, across social media, true crime forums, everywhere. People were accusing these girls of either being involved, covering something up, or lying. There has been so many questions why the 2 roommates weren't attacked, or why they didn't call 911 straight away, and that spun so many conspiracy theories online. Now, I'm not going to lie, when this first started happening, I probably did question myself, why did they not call a roommate sooner? But having dealt with anxiety the way I have, I know this is completely not relevant and not the same. You can get in a state where you're completely frozen and you absolutely do not know what to do. Although these girls are classed as adults for purposes of like voting or serving their country or whatever, drinking, they are still young girls, and you don't understand how terrifying that must have been. The only thing I don't understand is if she came face to face with the killer, why was that not said in the text messages between her and the roommate? I think it was only said like, I saw somebody in here, but I'm just not 100% sure what's going on there. I feel like there is a lot of information that the public don't know. However, police did come out in the early investigation and warned the public early on that the online rumours were harming the investigation and all of the people who were involved. The accusations did continue, and Dylan would later speak publicly for the first time at the sentencing hearing in 2025. Through tears, she called the killer a hollow vessel, something less than human. Now, the police actually did make a point in one of their press conferences to say that absolutely nobody who was a roommate was seen to be involved, nobody who called 911, and the guy at the food truck who they thought could potentially be involved. They did rule them out early on, but it's definitely not stopped any speculation, I would say. There was so many people working on this case. Moscow Police, Idaho State Police and the FBI all worked on this case. Surveillance footage from nearby areas showed a white Hyundai making multiple passes near the house in the early hours and then speeding away later on just after 4:20 am. Cell phone data and other digital evidence pointed towards a specific person and one specific vehicle. The breakthrough in this case and what led to catching the suspect came from DNA on the snap of the knife sheath left next to Maddie. Investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to identify one suspect. Bryan Kohberger. He was then a 28-year-old first-year PhD student studying criminology of all things at Washington State University near Pullman in Washington, less than 10 miles from where this crime happened. Investigators were actually watching Bryan in the days after the case when he was at his parents' house. Now, they had the genealogy DNA match, but that alone is not enough to go to court with. They needed his DNA, but they didn't want to give away that they were looking for him. They monitored him outside his parents' house, and then they decided that when he left trash at the side of the road, they picked it up, and that is when they got their match. Kohberger was then arrested on the 30th of December 2022 at his parents' house, and he was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felon burglary. The prosecution in this case actually wanted to go for the death penalty right off the bat, and after years of hearings, years of delays, on the 2nd of July last year of 2025, just weeks before the trial was actually set to begin, Bryan Kohberger took a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to all 4 counts and the burglary charge. The plea deal took the death penalty off the table. He has never given a motive and has never publicly explained why he done this. However, he sat in court in front of a judge when they said, "Did you murder Xana? Did you murder Kaylee? Did you murder Maddie? Did you murder Ethan?" He answered yes to every single question, and I think that is very important to note when you hear what has happened very recently in this case. A lot of the families were very conflicting when this plea deal happened. Some of them felt it was completely unfair and he should have had to have sat through a trial and explained why he did what he did. Some of them were just happy to finally get closure and wanted him put away for life. I can honestly see both sides of it, and I can see why there might be conflicting opinions on what the families wanted in this case. On the 23rd of July 2025, Judge Stephen Hippler sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus the 10 years for burglary. Family members of the victim and Dylan, the surviving roommate, delivered powerful impact statements in court, especially Kaylee's sister. If you have not heard this speech that she gave to Bryan Kohberger, you need to go and watch it. That woman is incredible. Bryan Kohberger, of course, declined to speak during this. In the most recent update in this case that has literally just happened a few days ago in July of 2026, Bryan Kohberger has filed a petition for post-conviction relief, asking the court to let him withdraw his guilty plea. In the petition and the statements from prison, he claims that his lawyers used threats, false promises and withheld vital information. He now claims that he is fully innocent and he wants a trial. He wants to take all of it back and he now wants to go to court. It is important to note though that his plea of being guilty has not been withdrawn. This is a formal legal request that a judge will have to decide on. Legal experts have noted that succeeding with this kind of petition is extremely difficult, especially after doing a full guilty plea and being given sentences. The victims' families have obviously strongly rejected the move. Kaylee Gonzalez's family have described him as a mosquito that you just can't seem to swat, and has asked people to keep their focus on the 4 students rather than a monster who murdered them and took their life away from them. The motive in this case is still unknown. The actual proper murder weapon was never actually recovered, although Amazon records did later show that Kohberger had purchased a Kabar knife that came with that sheath that they found. The main point in this case though, that again I want to reiterate, is that this case took away 4 young people. 4 young people with their whole lives ahead of them who had friends, families, jobs and plans for the future. Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin should all still be here. The surviving roommates must have lived with unbearable trauma and years of public suspicion. I'm going to be keeping my eye on this case, so if anything else does come out I will be sure to do an updated video. The questions I have in this case are mainly down to the motive. I have so many questions when it comes to certain aspects of this case. However, my personal opinion when it comes to the perpetrator is I do think Bryan Kohberger done this. He purchased the knife and the knife sheath was found with his DNA on it. The questions I have is if he acted alone, how he managed to do it so fast, and why the other roommates weren't targeted. This is by no means me accusing the roommates of anything or me saying that there's questions surrounding their involvement, if that makes sense. It's more just the sense of why Why did they do this, and why did he leave them? That I just can't seem to understand. I just wanted to take the time at the end of this video to say rest in peace to Kaylee, Maddie, Xana and Ethan. That is the main focus in this case. Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know what you guys think. Do you think it was him? Do you think he acted alone? Why do you think the other roommates weren't attacked? Just let me know, because honestly I still do have a lot of questions, but I think the new documentary was very well done and I would recommend anyone who's interested in this case to watch it. Thank you all so much for being here and watching and listening. Any case suggestions, please put them down below, and look after yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.
So I recently saw this video. And while that isn't necessarily true, Romania is the location of one of the most bizarre, unexplained mysteries that I have ever heard of. Because not only did this man up and disappear off the face of the earth, but 30 years later, he showed back up on his front doorstep wearing the exact same clothes he was wearing the day he went missing. He had no memory of the past 30 years. He could only recall his life up to the point of his disappearance. And when his family asked him where he's been this entire time, he looked at them and said, home. This is the disturbing and incredibly bizarre disappearance and reappearance of Vasil Gorgos. And if you love a good creepy mystery with seemingly no explanation, stick around and let's talk about it. This is Vasil Gorgos. He was only 63 years old when he disappeared in 1991. At the time, he was a cattle farmer and trader who lived in a small village near Bacău, Romania. His wife had previously passed away, so he spent almost all of his time on his farm with his 2 children. It was a family-run business, so everyone took turns helping out when they could. Vasil would occasionally travel to nearby cities to conduct his livestock business, but these trips were always super brief and only lasted a couple of days. During these trips, he would always stay in contact with his family back home. So on August 29th, 1991, when he bought his train ticket for a seemingly normal routine business trip, nobody gave this much thought. It wasn't unusual by any means. Vasil bought a train ticket for the route between Bacău and Ploiești in Romania. He kissed his family goodbye and told them that he would be gone for 2 days tops, but he never made it home, and what happened after this has never been explained. A few days came and went with no sign of Vasil. After the 3rd day, his family started to get really worried because it was not like him to not find a way to contact them. So they ended up reporting him missing to the local police, who initially weren't too worried because he was a grown man. They thought that he was just off on a longer business trip than usual and that he would come back soon. But then days turned into weeks, which then turned into months, and there was still no sign of Vasil. Eventually, authorities ramped up the investigation and conducted extensive searches. And this even included so many volunteers from neighboring villages. But it was like Vasil vanished into thin air. It was like he got onto the train and then poof, he was gone. There was absolutely no sign of him. Police couldn't find any signs of foul play though, and eventually, with no leads to go off of, his case soon fell cold. Everyone back home, even his own family, thought that he was dead after years had gone by with no sign of him. Every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, his family would hold a memorial for him. It was the only thing they could do. As life went on around them, Romania began to change, and new things were created and discovered, like the internet, mobile phones, and social media. It felt like Vasil and his way of life was just frozen in time. But then, 30 years later, something would happen that would turn this case upside down, proving the point that sometimes, even when you have answers, many things cannot be explained. On August 29th, 2021, literally 30 years to the day that Vasil went missing, a car pulled up in front of his old house. Luckily, since this was a family-run farm, it stayed in the family and wasn't sold, so all of his family still lived there. A 93-year-old man then steps out of the car, looking confused, and before anyone could realize what was going on, the driver of the car sped off. No one saw the license plate number, so the driver has never been identified. As this 93-year-old man walked up to the front door, he knocked, and when Vasil's family opened the door, they saw Vasil. He was standing right in front of them, now a 93-year-old man. I thought that was the craziest part about this case, but it gets even more bizarre, because not only was this the real Vasil standing in front of them, but he was wearing the exact same clothes that he was wearing the day he went missing, nearly 30 years prior. Inside his pockets were his ID and the exact train ticket that he'd bought for his 1991 business trip, the one he never returned from. What's even weirder is that despite it being 30 years later, his clothes and the train ticket were in really good condition. Usually after so much time has passed, you either wouldn't fit into those clothes anymore, or they would be really weathered and dirty and definitely not in good condition. But his were. It was at this point that Vasil was reintroduced to his family and his kids, who were now older as well, and at first they did not recognize him. He didn't recognize them either. He was in an almost delirious state, and he only talked about his life before he disappeared. Like the past 30 years was this big gap in his memory that he could not explain. The only things that he could remember was his name, where he was born, the fact that he used to raise and sell cows on this farm, the fact that his wife died, and who his father was, as well as remembering that he did have kids. He said he remembered his house, but when asked where he was for the past 30 years, his answer was chilling. He said he was home. Right here, the entire time. Needless to say, authorities were called, and Vasil was given a comprehensive medical examination. But what's super crazy is that he was in excellent health for his age. Other than the 30-year gap in memory, there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. Doctors could not explain why his memories only consisted of life before his 1991 business trip, but this left everyone speechless, especially his family. I mean, they were forced to come to terms with the fact that he was gone for 30 years, but now he's suddenly alive and standing right in front of them, but he didn't even know that 30 years had passed. It was bizarre, and no one had any explanation. And despite this happening in 2021, to this day, no one has been able to figure out what exactly happened to Vasil. But over the years, there have been a few main theories. Theory number one, which is believed by many people, is that Vasil had been living a double life. Maybe he had a secret family in one of the towns he visited for business, and then one random day in 1991, he just took off to go live with them, never coming back. Maybe whoever he left to go live with had no idea of his family back home, or the fact that he was a missing person. If that was the case though, I just don't get how no one saw him during those 30 years or figured it out. A lot of people think this is the most realistic explanation, and then once he got into his old age, it's possible he was experiencing early onset dementia or something like that. I mean, that would explain his memory loss, and then whoever he lived with in this secret life dropped him back off at his old house because they didn't want to deal with his medical issues. I think this is the biggest clue though. Whoever the driver was that dropped him off that day knew that this was his old house. So I think that directly contradicts them not knowing anything about his previous life. Or maybe he was perfectly healthy and then he just came back out of guilt. I don't know, but I think the biggest key to understanding this case is to somehow find out who that driver was. Theory number two is that he was kidnapped on his business trip and then forced to work for whoever kidnapped him. Then once he got older and his memory started to decline, they dropped him back off. I don't think this is super likely, but I don't know. Theory number three is super popular, and it's that Vasil was living a double life, but instead of hiding a family, he was hiding a criminal history. Some people think that he was arrested while he was on his business trip and then sent to prison. And then 30 years later, when his time was up, they released him and sent him back home. A lot of people think this could be the case because it's common for jails to release you in the same clothes that you came in with. And since he was wearing the exact same clothes as the day he went missing, and they were in good condition, this would kind of make sense. But I do feel like if this was the case, some record of him being in prison would have been found by now. And I think police would have found him back in 1991 if he had been arrested, because the first places they usually check when someone goes missing is hospitals, morgues, and jails in the surrounding areas. So I don't know if I really believe this theory or not, but it is interesting. Theory number four is that maybe Vasil had a severe dissociative personality disorder, or maybe he was experiencing an episode of dissociative fugue. DID is a mental health condition and is defined by the presence of two or more distinct personality states and significant memory gaps that go beyond normal forgetfulness. Dissociative fugue is a rare psychiatric condition where a person suddenly and purposefully travels away from home, loses their personal identity, and cannot remember their past. The doctors who examined Vasil think this could be a possibility, but for this to last for decades at a time is somewhat rare. It can totally happen, but in this case, it doesn't perfectly align. Theory number five is that something happened to Vasil while he was on his business trip that caused him to forget his identity, like maybe a head injury or something like that. But then there are much darker theories, like number 6 and number 7, that Vasil was abducted by aliens, which would explain his gap in time and the fact that he only remembered his house, and that he thought that he was just at home for the past 30 years, or that he was abducted by the government and experimented on, which again would explain his memory loss. Those are just some of the wild conspiracy theories though. But then again, everything about this case is bizarre. And lastly, some people think that his family is making this entire story up, that he really did disappear and come back, but that everything else about this story is made up. I don't know how exactly they would pull this off or why they would feel the need to lie, but you never know. I just think everything about this case is honestly deeply disturbing. Whether he willingly walked away or something else happened to him, it is so scary to think that someone could be missing for 30 years and then just one random day show back up on your doorstep like nothing ever happened. I don't know. What do you guys think happened? All I know is that it's now been 5 years since Vasil was found, yet whatever really happened to him all those years ago remains a mystery.
This mum was brutally murdered by the last person anyone would expect. It was January 2010 in Conyers in Georgia. Nikki Whitehead was 34 years old, living in the area, and she had twin daughters, Jasmaya and Tasmaya Whitehead. Now, the twins mostly actually lived with their grandmother, Della. This was because their mum, Nikki, had given birth to the twins aged just 17. She really struggled to look after two kids, being just a kid herself. And grandmother Della stated that due to Nikki's age when she had the kids, she would kind of flit in and out of their lives. She wanted to be a mum to them, but she also struggled with kind of wanting to be a normal teenager too. This changed though when the girls were 13. Nikki felt like she was finally able to be a proper mum to these girls, so she applied for custody of them in 2007. The twins weren't 100% happy with this though. They felt that they were settled with their nan and they didn't want this upheaval. And this really caused conflict between all of them because Nikki was granted custody. Girls were very unsettled and really misbehaved when they moved in with their mum. Nikki was trying to teach them right and wrong, but the girls felt like she was being a hypocrite. As the years went on, Nikki would scold them over things like smoking substances, but they argued back and said, well, we've seen you do this, so you kind of taught us to do this. Things would escalate between them all and sometimes even turn into physical fights. The girls ended up having to attend juvenile court due to their bad behaviour multiple times. They were very aggressive with their mum. So it probably goes without saying that the girls were temporarily handed back over to their nan, but the story does not end there. Nikki again fought for custody of the girls and was granted this for the second time in January 2010, when the girls were 16. But less than 10 days after being handed back over to their mother, a horrifying discovery was made. On the 13th of January, the girls returned home from school to find their mum dead. Now, they immediately flagged down police, who just so happened to be driving by at the time, to explain that they'd found their mum deceased in the bathtub at their home. And the officer at the scene found an absolute bloodbath. He even remarked that as he stepped into the home, he could smell the stench of blood. It was that bad. Nikki was absolutely covered in wounds. She'd been attacked with a vase. She had hideous injuries all over her body. She was actually described as completely unrecognizable. And the crime was very obviously a crime of passion. There was really no indication of a motive for a stranger to commit this murder. There was no forced entry. There was nothing missing from the home indicating a robbery, and there was no sign of SA. Investigators deemed that it was very unlikely that a stranger had done this to Nikki. Now, she did actually have a boyfriend at the time, and as with most murder investigations, he was pretty much the prime suspect. Officers knew that with such a chaotic crime scene, DNA could be really key here. Now, they initially questioned the two young girls and noted that they had scratches and bruises on them. But these were two rebellious teenagers who were often getting into physical fights, so it could have been the case that this had happened at school. Police treated them as victims who had clearly witnessed something horrific. But when officers scoured the crime scene, there was a really disturbing find. It was a journal, the twins' journal, and inside was incredibly damning evidence. There were paragraphs they'd written about how they needed to get rid of their mother, and one quote was, "She gotta go ASAP." They were also able to look through police records and find numerous occasions where Nikki, the mum, had rang police fearing for her life about how aggressive these twins were being towards her. When the twins were faced with the evidence against them, they eventually confessed to the brutal killing. And the details were absolutely chilling. They spoke of how an argument had broken out between them and their mum before school that day about them getting up late, and how Nikki had accused them of skipping school and being S active. Now, the twins claimed that Nikki had threatened them, but there was no proof of this. And what unfolded next was just about the most brutal death imaginable. Jasmine admitted to hitting her mum over the head with a vase, while Tasmaya grabbed a pot and smacked her with it. Tasmaya then grabbed a knife and brutally stabbed Nikki as her twin sister strangled her with a ribbon. Tasmaya then took the knife and also stabbed her repeatedly. The twins had then carried their injured mum to the bathtub, which was filled with water. They literally watched her bleed out and eventually sink under the water. They seemingly made some kind of small effort to conceal some of the things from the crime scene before casually heading to school. Now, despite their age, they were sentenced to 30 years in prison each for the hideous crime, and they were placed in separate prisons. It's unlikely that they will see each other until 2044.